Hey guys, we are back in the workshop and today we have part 2 of the Magnacut series, and today we are going to glue up those handles, shape the handles and finish up these knives. So let's get started with that. Alright, so before we can start with the glue up, we have to find the fitting handle material. And for these two bigger knives, I thought about OD green, and the good thing is this OD green is a little thicker than the standard stuff. The standard one is normally 6 millimeters, and this one is round about 8, so that will make it easier to shape later the Coke bottle handles that I want to do on these knives. And for these knives I also want to use some brass pins, which will look pretty nice. And then for this small hollow ground knife, probably use black. And then for this little slicing tool right here, we're going to use some purple G10. So for marking out the handles, I'm just using an angle and I'm just roughly scribing the lines onto the G10 with a scribing needle, so I have the measurement. And then I'm just moving over to my bandsaw. I'm using a metal bandsaw because that is just much easier to cut the G10, because wooden bandsaw blades, they're just getting dull really quickly. And those portable bandsaw blades, they're really nice for cutting G10. And now I'm just rounding off the pins so they will fit in easier later when I'm doing the glue up. I'm preparing the scales for the drilling, and I'm using these can twist clamps so I can just easily drill through both of these scales at the same time, and the holes will line up in the end really nicely. Because I have these can twist clamps on there, I'm using 1, 2, 3 blocks to get away from the drill table, so I can drill through these scales really nicely and I'm still square. So before I take off the clamps, I'm going to scribe the outer lines of the knife, because now everything is set. So I have a nice perimeter where I can grind to later. And I'm also marking the top of the handle scales and also the right side on both of these sides, so I always know where the scales will be and which is the outside and the inside of the scales in the end. Now I'm moving on to grinding the rough profile on these scales, and I'm putting in the pins so everything is nice and both sides will be the same. And I also marked out where my handle scales should end, starting off with 50 grit. I'm just grinding away the G10. You can also use a bandsaw beforehand, but I didn't have that much material to remove, so I'm just using the coarser grit. And later on I'm going to finish up the portion where we can't grind later. I'm finishing up that up to a 400 grit, and you can see the 50 grit makes really quick work of the G10. It's super easy to just grind away and get the rough shape set. And now I'm drilling in some small detents into the side where we are going to add the glue, and that just helps with we can put in more glue and we have more surface where the glue can attach to, so we have a more stable glue up in the end. The knives are now nearly ready to be glued up, and we're here at my sandblasting cabin, and I will sandblast the insides of the scales from the G10 because often the G10 has a really smooth surface finish on it, and we want to get rid of that. You can also use sandpaper on a flat surface, and I'm just using my sandblasting cabinet. It's much faster and I get a really nice texture on the G10. so the glue has more surface area to grip on, and that is just a better glue up. I'm also going to sandblast the knives, so the more texture we have, the better the glue up will be. If you want to start your glue up, you should always clean your scales and the knife really well. I'm just using some acetone, and I've also taped up the blades of the knife so we don't get any epoxy on there. And I'm using the G-Flex 24-hour epoxy. And I'm just globbing it on in the end, so we have a really nice glue up. Also in these holes, I'm also adding some of the epoxy. The more epoxy, the better it holds. So the glue has dried overnight. I'm using 24-hour G-Flex epoxy, which is one of the best epoxies for knife glue ups. And now we have to finish up the handle. It still looks super rough. And because we are using brass pins, we have to be super careful that we don't overheat them, because that could burn the glue up. So we always have to keep it cool, use some coarser grits to get rid of those pins, and work our way slowly up so we can flatten out these handle scales, always dipping it into water and always checking with my hand if the pins, so the pins don't get too hard, and I can check that and I have to dip it into water. Let's get these handles finished up and finish up these cool knives. So I'm grinding away these pins. You could also use a bandsaw, and I just don't have any sharp bandsaw blades, and they could also overheat those pins. So I'm just grinding them slowly away so I don't burn them off. So maybe I should get some new bandsaw blades. Going to grind away on the vertical grinder, just with a rough grit, and then I'm going to change to the horizontal mode, so we just have a nice square knife and handle scales in the end. And it's just nicer if those grinding lines, they follow the knife and they're not vertical or 90 degrees to the scales, and that just gives you a really nice finish. And also the same here with the small contact wheel, also 90 degrees, so we can square everything off. You just have to be careful so you don't overheat the steel, because that can burn off the epoxy and damage your glue up. So you should always be careful when you're grinding like that. And now I'm grinding again on the vertical grinder, and I'm just grinding the small taper on the beginning of the knife, and later we are going to smooth that out with the hollow grinding wheel. Here I'm using an 8-inch contact wheel, again with a 90 degrees work rest attached to it, and I'm just smoothing it in, feathering in the knife so we have a nice Coke bottle handle. And then I'm going to use some sandpaper. I'm using belts for that, and I'm just going to rough that. And you can also do that with the belt grinder, but I'm not that experienced in these kind of handles, so I'm working rather slowly, but just to ensure everything is nice, square, and it looks and feels amazing. But I should get more training on the belt grinder so I can work faster on these kind of handles. So the knives are also sandblasted. I sandblasted the handles again, and now we are going to apply an acid stonewash to these knives. Yes, you can put G10 into ferric chloride. You just have to be careful with like white G10 that can suck up the yellow color of the ferrochloride, so you should be careful of that, and that it's no big problem. I also covered up the brass pins with some nail polish, because that can also get a slight coloring due to the ferrochloride acid. So that's why I'm just using some nail polish and covering these up, and after that I can just clean it up with acetone. So let's get these knives darker. So the knives are nearly done now. The only step that we have to do is sharpening them. And for my sharpening system, I'm using actually 4T4 Tormex with certain grids on it. So I'm starting with 320, 600 and 1200, and then I've got a leather stropping wheel, which is the same size as the grinding wheels I have on the other Tormex, which is just easier to hold the angle because I can use the same work rest that I'm working on, because the Tormex has a smaller leather strap on the side, but you have to do it by hand. And with the other setup, I can just use the same angle, which is just much easier to use. So let's get these knives sharp and getting them ready to be shipped out. Alright guys, so we are done with these knives and I'm pretty happy. They are sharp, they are oiled up, they look really nice, and I'm pretty happy on how these knives turned out, especially with that big one. It just feels amazing, and its little brother, they have the same size of handles, but the blade length is much different. That's like you, and that's the guy she told you not to worry about. So yeah, they're pretty amazing with that slight convex grind and the Magnacut steel. Also the other kind of knives that I made, like this one where we used some parts of the steel that I maybe wouldn't have used for another project, but we still got out a little tiny slicing tool with that purple color. It just looks amazing. And also this one with the hollow grind, pretty amazing. Really like it, feels amazing, and you can do a lot of work with that one. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, this part 2 of finishing these Magnacut knives. If you have any questions, just drop them down below. I try to answer them as quickly as possible. If you want to see more kind of videos like that, just hit the subscribe button. And also, if you want to see me maybe build something that you haven't seen here, just also drop it down below, and I try to attack on these projects as well. Alright guys, I have nothing more to say, and we'll see us in the next episode.